Welcome to This Week in Human Relations and Criminal Justice. This week, we're going to talk about a lot of different things that happen through the lifespan. We're going to talk about learning strategies, how perception works into not only your daily lives, but into your working environment. And then we're going to talk about how changes throughout your lifespan affect not only your work, but your life in general. During this chapter, we're going to understand the basic learning processes, which is broken down into 3 advanced learning processes, and how e-learning has entered into that process as well. We'll explain the meaning of learning styles, which will help you develop insight into your own style of learning, explain the importance of continuous learning throughout the lifespan, explain how perception influences behavior, and go through the stages of the life cycle. We'll understand the challenges of responding to changes in adolescence, adulthood, and late adulthood, and describe the impact of the lifespan on life and job satisfaction. We'll recognize and deal with realities of dealing with a career change, and in turn, talk about how to be better prepared to cope with that change. So we have a lot to cover, so we'll get started by first talking about some major learning strategies that will help us understand the rest of this chapter. To begin, we need to actually define what learning is, and it's generally going to be a lasting change in your behavior based on not only practice, but your experience. And so when we look at how we develop through our lifespan and how we learn to do things, we're expected to be able to be flexible at learning skills within our education, within our jobs as we flow from one to another, with the technology that comes with those jobs. And so with that, we have to obtain knowledge and skills when it comes to not only the jobs that we have in preparation for our career, but as our career of our chosen field going forward. And so in the field of criminal justice, learning those job skills is very precise in that we will learn a whole bunch of job skills in the beginning in flourish. And by that I mean we're expected to learn all of the things to prepare us for that job. Most notably, for those entering police or corrections, we're going to get a lot of those job skills right when we go through the academy. And then the knowledge that goes along with that you get here in school in order to prepare for the beginning of your career. What happens and what we'll continue to talk about as we continue through this chapter is that's not where it stops. And so it has to be a continuous process. So how does that happen? Well, it happens in several different methods and over the course of your lifetime. And we start with the idea of classical conditioning. And this is the idea of learning very simple habits and reflexes to be able to do the most elementary types of things. And most of you have heard of classical conditioning, and it is how we learn not to do the same thing twice if it hurts, or continue to do the behavior that is rewarded or ends up with a good response. So it's the simple association between stimulus and response. The biggest advocate or researcher into this was Pavlov with the Pavlov's dog, And classical conditioning helps us to establish habits in everyday life. So what we get is a reward that is usually associated with a habit that encourages repetition of the behavior. And the idea of habitual is performing the same act almost without thinking, in the same location or at the same time every day, that is based on the subtle cues that we, after a while, don't even recognize as happening. So that's the idea behind classical conditioning, is we start to, at the very basic points of our life and throughout the rest of our life, we'll start to do those things without even realizing that we're doing them, whether it's good or bad. You know, if we get conked on the head because we have bent down and hit our head on a counter, well, we're going to remember the counter's there so that we don't get conked on the head again. That's going to be classical conditioning. And so it happens good and bad. So that's the beginning level of how we learn, is those simple habits or reflexes that we get from a very young age. And so that lays the first level of foundation in how we learn as individuals. Second type of learning that we do as individuals is known as operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is going to be learning that takes place as a consequence of our behavior. And so this is as a result of what we do, and we learn through operant conditioning that our actions are going to be instrumental in determining what happens, and that will in turn determine whether learning takes place. Operant conditioning was the cornerstone of the research of behaviorism that was done a lot by B.F. Skinner, who, if you study criminology, is a name that will continue to pop up in research to try and explain behavior of criminals and those in institutions and things like that. This is a process by which a person is going to learn the correct way to do things, or as a result of their behavior, will either not change their behavior because they don't want to, or will because they don't like the results of their actions. Now, there's several reinforcement strategies that we'll spend the next couple of slides talking about, as far as how you can go about, or how people go about learning their changes in behavior. We're going to talk about positive and negative reinforcement, what that means, how it's different, and how people can get them confused. We're going to talk about punishment, and then extinction. And all will have their own place in operant conditioning, and how we, as a consequence of our behavior and then the actions, will determine whether the person will actually learn from their behavior. When it comes to positive reinforcement, this is the idea that it adds something rewarding to a situation, like a praise or monetary reward for something that was done. So you're giving somebody reward for something that was desired behavior. The other side of that is negative reinforcement. And this is sometimes effective because you remove something unpleasant from a situation. So this is also known as avoidance learning. And so you're being rewarded by being relieved of something that is discomforting. And so people sometimes get that confused with punishment, because they think that negative reinforcement can't actually be reinforcing behavior. And in actuality, it is, because you're taking something that they want away from them, which is in turn the taking away of something unpleasant. So, for instance, in our field of work, what you're trying to do is get people to comply with the expectations of your facility. And so a lot of times with the use of negative reinforcement to get them to the behavior that you want them to have, they will be in an unpleasant situation. Negative reinforcement is going to be removing them from that unpleasant situation and letting them know that their behavior, their compliance behavior, removed them from that bad situation, that bad area that they were in. That's not considered punishment. That's considered negative reinforcement. So if you had to lock somebody down or to take away a privilege, and they understood that the way to get that privilege back was to act the way that they were expected to, that's negative reinforcement. And so a lot of people sometimes confuse that idea behind that. Now, the idea of punishment, we all understand what that is. That's the introduction of an unpleasant stimulus as a consequence of the behavior. Threats of punishment can also be used. And so the idea behind punishment is that it assists with the idea of operant conditioning because it weakens the particular response. The only time that punishment really doesn't work is if somebody enjoys the punishment. And we all know there are people out there that do that. But people who respond to punishment will stop the behavior that brought the punishment on, therefore going along with the idea that operant conditioning can teach people, or they will learn through the consequences of their behavior. The last type of reinforcement strategy is going to be this idea behind extinction. This is weakening or decreasing the frequency of the undesirable behavior by removing the reward for such behavior. So it's the absence of reinforcement. This is sort of the idea of not responding to somebody who continually cracks offensive jokes. And so instead of laughing, or instead of everybody laughing, they ignore them. And so then after a while, they get the idea that they're just not going to get any reaction out of you, so they stop making those jokes. And while your book uses that as the example, that's an idea behind extinction, is to stop any sort of reinforcement, positive, negative, punishment, anything, so to stop the behavior altogether. And that's the idea behind extinction. So there are some ideas behind the consequences of our behavior that is the biggest part of operant conditioning that we use so that people who, and us as individuals, can learn through our behavior and what happens when we realize that there are consequences to the behavior, good or bad, through these reinforcement strategies. The biggest part of making sure that learning takes place with the idea of reinforcement is how frequently to make sure the rewards or reinforcement is done. And so there are two different types of schedules to use when you're figuring out how to use reinforcement, whether it's negative or positive, whether it's punishment, whether it's extinction, and that is either to have it done continuously or whether to do it more on an intermittent schedule. Now, when you do it continuously, it actually is going to be the fastest way to teach somebody or have people learn. But the problem is when you stop giving that continuous reinforcement, then the behavior that you were hoping to get is going to die off because they always expect to have that reinforcement. With intermittent reinforcement, what you get is the desired behavior, so they're learning, but what they're learning is that the behavior is better than the reinforcement. And when you have behavior learned, and then what happens is they will get that reward intermittently, so what they get to understand is the behavior is more important than the reinforcement they receive. And so intermittent reinforcement actually is more effective in sustaining the behavior because we as learners will continually stay interested and therefore mentally will stay in the game because we're always wondering if us keeping that behavior as a constant will end up with the reward in the long run. Now we also, through operant conditioning, will learn some different ways of how behavior goes. And these couple of different ways are either through modeling or through informal learning. These are ways that we can learn complicated skills. And learning complicated skills is how we will continue to learn cohesive and flowing patterns of behavior. And by modeling, that means we're going to observe how other people perform. This is how we learn socially, and it's by paying attention to how others act when we're in social circles. We in criminal justice do a lot of modeling because to actually learn our jobs in a sufficient and adequate way, and more than adequate, we have to go through field training. Now, we all know that our education is an important part of how we do our jobs, because without the book part of it, we have really little foundation of how to understand the intricacies of the criminal justice system and the behavior patterns of the people who we interact with on a regular basis. But part of our education to begin our careers is also going to be learning the tasks of our everyday duties. And to do that, we have to have some training by those who have already been in the job for several years. And so part of our learning strategies and part of how we do that is through the idea of modeling, because we are assigned to an officer who can show us by performing those jobs and those skills, and then we will take from that experience what we feel would best work for us. So us in the criminal justice field do a lot of modeling behavior. One of the reasons that we get tasked and get assigned to different field officers to train with is so that we can learn behavior and observe other people and learn different ways to handle similar situations, so that by doing that, we can get that important information and then figure out for ourselves how we would handle that information if we were put in that situation. Another type of learning strategy and through and learning complicated skills is through informal learning. Now, informal learning is going to happen outside the classroom, and what the idea behind this is that we take the opportunity to share knowledge with others. And again, although it's not unique to criminal justice, it's something that we do on a daily basis. How do we do that? It's by sharing information at the end of shifts. It's looking at a hot sheet. It's sharing information between officers at training about different ideas, different things they've seen or heard or researched. And so all of this is knowledge sharing, and the more we can knowledge share, the better off we are learning things that can help us in our jobs in the long run. And so this is an idea of how we can learn more complicated skills and use that to our betterment in our jobs and careers. The last learning strategy that has come in within the last 25 years or so is the idea of e-learning. Now, especially in the private sector, because we are such a global industrial world now, is that companies will take advantage of the fact of using mobile phones and tablets, videos, and things like that to get learning across to many individuals who are dispersed across the world at their very different business locations, and be able to get everybody the same information no matter where they are, what time zone they are, etc. And so a lot of times the reasons that e-learning is used in our line of work is more budgetary than it is geographic dispersion. A lot of times training budgets are not extensive enough to allow for officers to be able to either go off site or to be able to have all of them in one central location. And so the use of e-learning has become a relied upon way to get a large amount of information on a central topic that everyone needs to know, and allow them access to that information so that they can have the information that they need to be able to perform their jobs correctly. And so while e-learning for the business sector tends to be for far different reasons, criminal justice has started to rely more and more on e-learning simply because of money and staffing issues for dispersal of information and making sure they have the required information that they need to get to their officers. One other type of training that comes open in the business world are called massive open online courses. Now, this is not necessarily unique and only open to the business community, but what these are courses that are offered by universities and colleges throughout the world that would allow you to take free outside courses. Usually it's for business, but you can enroll in self-paced online courses that have virtual lectures, some graded exercise, and companies tend to rely on these MOOCs as part of their required business learning. Not very necessary in criminal justice work, but it is a form of e-learning that tends to be used quite often in the private sectors. One of the things that we have to remember within the scope of e-learning, and for anybody who's interested, and obviously because you guys are online, you already know this, is when you decide to take an online class, you have to have a lot of self-motivation and self-discipline. There has to be time management and organizational skills, because when you take any sort of online or e-learning class, you you know that a week may seem like a long time, and then before you know it, it's Wednesday night, and life got in the way. You had work and maybe overtime, and all these things started coming away, and all of a sudden it's Wednesday night at 8 o'clock, and the assignment still wasn't done. And so there still needs to be a lot of stuff that goes into being able to take advantage of what e-learning and online is. And so if you're going to do this, remember to take and evaluate strengths and limitations. And this is for an employer too. If they're going to start utilizing e-learning as a major component of the training for their officers, make sure there's a big enough time frame. Make sure you just don't release it once and then expect your officers to remember that it's due by a certain date. There needs to be follow-up, because where you have some very self-motivated, self-disciplined officers, you're also going to have those officers that either won't care, won't remember, or have things that happen and they just leave it to the last minute. We have our natural procrastinators. And so there has to be an understanding of what the strengths and limitations are. There's also always going to be those trainings that need classroom interaction. And so whatever you decide to use for e-learning should be best left for those trainings that are best for conceptual matter. And make sure that when you're using e-learning as opposed to the face-to-face or in your in the training center, that it's for those that don't require interpersonal skills or sharing information, and you're only using the e-learning for those that just you need to understand concepts and can take those in and comprehend those and know those, rather than the things that need interaction. Also, part of learning is going to be learning within a group. The idea of learning in a group is having the ability to have several different ideas in order to get new knowledge, learn new routines, or share behaviors and learn new behaviors within the group. So with sharing, group members will also get an understanding of what others in the group have, what they've learned, and how they handle situations within that learning process. And so within the idea of group learning, we learn to share what our knowledge is with others, and we learn from others what they share. Once we do that, then what we do is we store the knowledge that we have learned from others and what their routines and behaviors are, and we store that in the back of our memory. All of us have a little bit of a Rolodex that we keep in the back of our head. And so when we are part of a group and we are able to share all of our knowledge and routines and behaviors in a group setting, then we take some of what we've learned and we put that in the back of that little mental Rolodex. And so storage will help us in learning new things. And we may not use them right away, but what we'll do is we'll put them in that part of our Rolodex that will allow us to use them at a later date. And that takes us to what the retrieval is. And so what that is our ability to then take that little nugget of information at the right time, take it out of the Rolodex, and then use it when we have to. And so part of the group learning experience is to understand that there are ways that we can collaborate with people who have shared experiences, who have handled these experiences, and through those shared experiences, we can figure out how we can either handle it better, different, and then the next time that situation comes up, we have the ability to take that information and use it the next time we need to. Also, part of our ability to learn is how we learn. And so there are several different ways that people learn. And typically, we have figured out that people either learn through visually, by being able to watch how somebody does something and then they can figure it out, by hearing what people are saying and then they can comprehend it and keep it and learn the behavior that way. Some people can learn better if they are by themselves and can concentrate fully. I tend to be one of those people. I don't do well if I have a lot of outside interference, and if I can be distracted easily by outside voices. So I tend to keep my office door shut quite a bit to make sure that I can concentrate on what I'm doing. I don't really do well in groups, but some people do very well in groups because they are able to share their information and they take that information in and it inspires them and they learn very well that way. Other people have to be near people in order to have that hands-on and kinesthetic ability to learn by trying, and be able to look at something, grab it, and just fool with it until they figure it out. Most people tend to be more of an visual learner, which means they have to be able to look at something and they can comprehend it. I think the percentage is around 70% of people tend to be more audio visual learners. But there are quite a few people out here that are kinesthetic, which means they tend to have to be very hands-on. The person that, if you're trying to teach him how to tape a hockey stick, you can't show them. You just have to hand them the tape and the stick, and they'll figure it out. You can try and explain it, but they'll figure it out and they'll do it. But to try and explain it to them, it just doesn't work. And so if you figure out how best you learn, then that can help you with the amount of information that you can bring in and store. Because chances are you're not going to be able to go through your entire life without having to work in different situations. I never got through college without working in groups. I preferred to work individually, but I had to work in groups. Same with when I was in my career. I was part of groups to figure out changes in policy and stuff like that. And so you have to be able to adapt. I knew what I preferred, but if I knew how best I could adapt to working in groups, then I could understand how I could figure things out. Another part of learning is figuring out what your learning style is and the fact that it most likely is going to be associated with what type of personality you have. And so there is a personality instrument that is in your book. It's kind of an abbreviated version if you really want to figure out in depth what kind of personality type you have. If you haven't gone through it already, you can get online and figure it out. But the Golden Personality Type Profiler that's located in your book is really interesting to figure out if you are the personality type you think you are. But basically it is going to be 4 essential parts of a personality. It's how your energy goes, how you gather information, how you go about making decisions, and then how you orient your lifestyle. And so when we look at energy flow, The questions are geared toward determining whether you are an extrovert or an introvert. And then they'll ask questions on how you tend to gather information, whether you do it through sensations or through intuition and how you perceive things. How you make decisions is going to be determined through a very rational thinking mind or emotion and feeling. And then the last is your lifestyle orientation, which is whether you are very judgmental and deliberate, or whether you are very perceiving of things. And so when you look at the figure and how you can figure out how you do things, you end up getting a 4-letter score if you go through the entire personality. And I did once when I was sent to a school in Texas back before I retired. And I don't remember what I was. I think I ended up being a introvert who was intuitive, with feeling that was judgmental, or judging, which meant that I kind of had a little bit of everything. So I tended to be introverted, who was a little bit more intuitive, but made my decisions through feeling, and was much more judging, if I remember right. And it was 10 years ago when I did it. So it was something that I was kind of surprised at. I wasn't surprised at the introvert, but I was kind of surprised at the rest of it, because I thought I was much more thinking rather than feeling. But either here nor there, I encourage you at some point in your career to take this personality type profiler, if you haven't already, to kind of let you know how your personality might explain how things happen and how you are going to be able to learn. Now let's take a moment and talk about how we can improve how we learn through the functioning of our brain. And one thing that we all know is that we need to do that by making sure we get enough rest. And then tell you that with this profession, we have to make sure that we get enough rest, period. And so while we're going to talk a minute about how, in order to get maximum brain functioning, we'll improve our learning and we need to rest, we also need to remember that in an earlier chapter we talked about stress and how we can manage our stress. The importance of it is rest not only improves our brain functioning and then will allow us to learn better, but it's also going to make sure that how we handle stress in our life and extends our lifespan, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, is essential. Now, that being said, because we have shift work, that means it's going to be harder, which means we have to make it more of a priority. So let's take a look at what it means to the brain when we don't get enough sleep. We've always been told that inactivity is worse for our brain, but sometimes our brain just needs to be rested. And so that's going to be our main goal in understanding why it needs to sleep. Sleeping is going to improve our memory and then better our attention span. So think about it. Right now, one of the things that people suffer from if they don't get enough sleep is a lapse of memory and a weakness in being able to concentrate on things, or our attention span goes to crap. And so one of the things that getting constant straight sleep and teaching stress management in the academy that I've done, we recommend anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 hours of sleep. I get it. I know if we have, we work midnight shift, we have to get the kids ready for school, then we have to try and grab sleep before we pick up the kids from school. It's hard. to get straight sleep like that. These are what we're trying to convey, is that the more sleep you get, the stronger your memory is going to be, the better attention span you're going to have. And the reason is straight sleep, getting you into REM, is going to reduce your brain overload, which will help your memory. And in the end, having that happen means that your cognitive skills, your ability to learn, and then adopting the right personality traits or having the right personality traits will help you learn more. And so that is the research that's been done. Now, we have to understand, we have one of the hardest careers for us to achieve this particular thing. Okay, anybody in public service, whether it's police, corrections, fire, EMT, nursing, it's hard. And so priority needs to figure out how we can make sure that our brain functions at its best in order for us to not only be able to learn, but to keep our memory intact, to be able to reduce that brain overload and continue to learn throughout our lifetime. So I can't overemphasize enough that not only because science supports it, but your stress will continue to remain low if you are able to remain rested and give your brain a break when it needs a break. And one of the things we also talked about earlier was that learning doesn't stop when you get your degree and you get your first job in this field. We have to embrace the knowledge and the understanding that you will continue to learn as you go through your career. Some of it's mandated by your employer, but some of your continuous learning is going to be without your knowledge. You're just going to pick up things either through modeling or through informal learning or however your body and your brain picks it up. But a lot of times your career success and even your survival, especially in this field, is going to depend on continuous learning. And that's why I've mentioned throughout this course and a lot of the other courses that you have taken in this field that your responsibility as an officer coming into this career is not to rely solely on your employer to provide the training and continuous education you need in this field. That by taking it upon yourself to go to your professional organizations and to look to the areas that can provide you with the extra knowledge and skills that you can obtain throughout your career will help with your not only career success but survival. And so the continuous learning that you will have upon your continued lifespan and your career is important. And so a lot of this is how you are going to approach your desire to learn. And how you approach your learning is going to be important. So a lot of this is going to be not only what you obtain relating to your career field, but how you relate to others, how you handle changes within your job, how you handle diversity issues, how you handle interpersonal skills. All of those things are going to be part of your journey through learning as you move on in your career. And so make sure that as you continue on in your career, that you embrace the idea of continuous learning. It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't mean that you have to continue on in a formal education, but you will always, always be learning. Next, we're going to talk about perception. Perception are the various ways that people interpret the things that are around them in the outside world, and then how they in turn will act on the basis of how those perceptions are. And with that, we're going to also talk about why these perceptual problems exist. And we'll talk about some agreement about how perceived events happen and how people perceive the causes of behavior, and we'll break those down too. Now, one of the reasons that perceptual problems exist is what we call the characteristics of stimulus. And what this is dependent on what the motives, needs, and knowledge is of the people affected by what's going on. And so a lot of the stimulus that's coming is dependent upon the information that they're receiving, and therefore the perception is dependent on the information that they're getting. For instance, if you find that in our line of work, you find that the sergeants or the openings are not being filled, but you're getting no explanation as to why they're not being filled, the perception can be that there's going to be layoffs, that we don't have the budget. And it could be that they don't have the applicant pool. And one way to combat the misperceptions is to provide more information. So perceptual problems exist based on the characteristics of the stimulus. Are you getting enough information? Are you getting the right information? And what the emotional meaning has to you as the person receiving the stimulus. You also have the mental processes of how we deal with sensory information. That is, the information we receive, how we hear it, how we see it, and that will play a role in how we interpret it. And so that's how we are built in to interpret defensive behavior, and this is defensive behavior for us. And that will parlay itself into what's known as selective attention. And so we're only going to pay attention to that which kind of fits into that fits our what we need at the time, or what we want at the time, or what we're interested in at the time, or what we're only going to pay attention to. And so if it's not that important, then we're not going to pay attention to it, and therefore it's not going to be on our radar, and we're not going to perceive its importance, and it's not going to influence us. So this is why these problems exist, and how perception influences how we interpret things in our world. Also, part of the mental processes that we go through will be denial, which is excluding from awareness the importance of the issue at hand. So in order to protect us from the painful aspect of reality, for instance, if you are dealing with the prospect that if a new budget doesn't get passed, then you could be laid off. So you don't deal with the fact that the budget hasn't been ratified yet. And so you're just planning on not being laid off, and so you don't pay attention to the memos that come out, or the talks that are done, or anything like that. And then when you get laid off, you act like you're totally surprised when there was information that said, we probably should prepare because the budget's looking like it's not going to get passed. And that's part of denial. It's a way that we kind of exclude from our awareness what's important in order to kind of steel ourselves against what's painfully in our reality at that time. There's also the idea of stereotyping, and I won't go into a big detail about this because we all kind of know what stereotyping is. We're stereotyped as officers of the criminal justice system. Other people are stereotyped for other reasons. We might be stereotyped because of our perceived work ethic. But to simplify perception, we, as stereotyping, will evaluate either an individual, a thing, a culture, a work group based on the person or the object to which the person belongs, and as a result, it could be favorable or unfavorable. And we all have been either a part of it or have done it, whether we have really been conscious of stereotyping in our past. The next one of how we perceive or go through the mental processes is known as the halo effect. Now, the halo effect can either be negative or positive, but what it is declaring one favorable or unfavorable trait of a person, and it absolutely colors everything about that person, again, either negatively or positively. And therefore, that person either can do no wrong or can do no right as a result of that one recognizable or favorable or unfavorable trait. For instance, if you have a coworker that is always late, that could be perceived as an unfavorable trait. So that clouds your judgment no matter what they do. They could get their projects in on time. They could be the nicest person. They could be a team player, doesn't matter. But the fact that they are always on time and you are always early is an unfavorable trait that puts a negative halo over them, and therefore limits your ability to give them favorable evaluations or anything like that, or give them a favorable effect in your eyes when it comes to talking about them to fellow people. The last one is projection. And projection also is a term that I'm sure you've heard before. It's where you project your own faults onto others instead of making an objective appraisal of the situation. And the idea behind this is that you kind of blame somebody else for what actually was something that happened that was your fault, instead of looking at what happened and going, yeah, that was my bad. That was something that I did, and it shouldn't have happened. Or you look at the same situations, two different circumstances, and look at how it was handled. So projection is kind of putting the blame or projecting your own faults onto others, instead of kind of objectively being able to appraise how the situation is actually occurring. When you look at this chart here, this is basically how perceptions can be interpreted, and how it kind of goes around the wheel, and from what is said to how we process it, and then back around again. And so you start off with something that somebody says, such as an evaluative statement. Did you say I'm doing okay? That's considered an emotionally charged stimulus. You're trying to find out how you're doing about something. So then it goes into perceptual distortion, which your body's trying to, or your brain's trying to interpret that message. And what comes out is you hearing, or what they said was, I think you said or you're interpreting, I think you said I'm doing pretty well. So what you're going into is these mental processes that will allow you to decipher so that you can process it and perceive it to the best of how you can handle it. Now, how your body decides to do that will determine and be decided by how you have learned to handle the intent of the statement, or how it was, how you meant to perceive it. It could be selective attention, whether you meant to understand it at all. You could look at it and decide who it is that said it, and if they're somebody that you've put into a stereotype, you might dismiss it at all and not have it mean anything. If it's somebody who has a halo effect for you, whether it's a favorable or an unfavorable one, you could dismiss how it affects you and how you perceive that particular statement. And the same goes with projection. So all of these, with just one simple sentence, is going to be how we deal and process, and how then in the end, how we perceive it ends up with this emotionally charged stimulus. Our last discussion, as far as perception, is the idea behind perceptual congruence. And this is the idea of how many people perceive things the same way. If we have a high congruence, we're generally figuring that the perception of something is valid. Low congruence generally means that there is not enough perception for that idea to be valid. However, we need to keep in mind that people can have high congruence on a distorted perception. And I think we see in some forms out there, especially with how social media is being used and things like that, that there are instances with the idea of a high congruence, a lot of people agreeing on distorted perceptions, depending on what you're looking or hearing at. So perceptual congruence is the ability to and degree to which people perceive things in the same way. And I think we're seeing a lot of perceptual congruence and a high congruence with a lot of things that are out in our society today. But we have to remember, just because there's high congruence doesn't mean that its perception is not distorted. And so we have to remember that theory also. When we talk about the idea of attribution theory, we're trying to figure out what causes the behavior and how we perceive the causes of behavior and what we attribute a given behavior. So when we talk about this theory, it's that most people give relatively little weight to the circumstances in making judgments about a person's behavior, and we're more likely to attribute a person's actions or results to personal characteristics than to outside forces. So we attribute our achievements to us and the qualities in our personality. But if we fail at something, then we're going to blame it on the outside factors. So that's the person who, or that's people who, if we do a good job at something, such as being able to increase our ability to gain customers if you work in retail. That's going to be based on our wonderful customer service skills. But if in the reverse, all of a sudden the manager comes and says that the report has been down as far as customers coming into the store, or that you have had a reduction in sales, well, then it's the economy, or it's the location of the store, or that somebody else has been taking all the sales calls. It's never your fault or what you've done. It is outside factors. And so that's what the attribution theory is when it comes to figuring out how we interpret the world that we live in. Our next area is going to be talking about the life cycle and how we are going to respond through our lifetime to the different lifespan changes, what's most important, why it's important, and where learning comes in, and the most important things of learning perception during those particular important life cycles and stages moving forward. Now, the research that's been done has broken down that there are 8 stages within our life cycle that the socialization that takes place is the most important. And the reason that is because there are psychosocial or mind social crises that are instrumental in how we learn and how we perceive and then how we change our behavior as a result of these. And so we look at infancy, toddler, preschool, elementary school, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. These are the essential stages of which we learn. As we learn, we can resolve what we need to in order to go through to the next stage, and then we can manage our lives through to the next and much later stages. If we look at this chart, we get a timeline, and we'll go into it in a little bit more detail in the following slides. But this is kind of a flow chart of how we actually go through these lifespan changes and what we can expect to learn and have to go through in order to move to the next stage. First one, of course, is infancy. And that's going to be the first year of life where you can't do anything unless you learn basic trust. And one of the reasons that we see a lot of the clientele we do in corrections and why we run across a lot of the people we do in police work is because a lot of the learning basic trust and distrust is learned in this stage, and we don't even realize it. This and the toddler years of 1 to 2 years. That basic trust and autonomy versus shame and learning will. If there's no way that they can learn these basic things, or there's no way that they can form those trust bonds, then it turns into a greater timeline of being able to learn those types of behaviors and to be able to resolve them later in life. And so that begins a slowdown and being able to manage those next and later stages successfully. We get a lot of behavior disorders as a result of failure to manage these behaviors and stages this early, and they have to start or learn later in life how to do that. As far as preschool is concerned, this is where they start to learn initiative versus guilt. Now, very early on, when we start learning about why they do the things they do, they're going to start figuring out why they make the decisions they do. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But they'll learn initiative versus guilt, the purpose of why they did what they did. Then they move into elementary school, and then they move into adolescence. We're going to spend a lot of time into adolescence. But if you look, the time span between learning and resolution starts to grow bigger as you move through these different lifespan changes. And so as we get into adolescence, that's 6 years. That's, of course, the teen years. And you're learning your identity versus identity diffusion, that fidelity of figuring out peers and parents and time spent. Then you start to move into adulthood. And your adulthood is that middle 20 years where you're trying to figure out what's best for you. You're learning things like who you want to spend your life with, what you want to do, and things like that. As you move into middle adulthood, which is that 25 years where you're learning things as far as building your family, planning for your future, And then you move into late adulthood, and we're going to talk about those major lifespan changes as we move forward. As mentioned earlier, the biggest times or the most important times in our lifespan are those starting at adolescence through late adulthood. So we're going to take a look at the challenges that happen in adolescence, why they're so important, and some of the big things that we need to keep in mind that move us into whether we successfully navigate these lifespan changes, and what we can learn from them, or what we hope to learn, and how our learning happens during these changes and lifespans. So in adolescence, we already know that the lifespan, or the time span, is usually between the ages of 13 and 19. And with that, there are marking points that happen during this time frame. But there's also challenges that happen during adolescence that influence perception, learning, and everything like that. And while what we're going to talk about is kind of generalities, because there are adolescents that will vary considerably in the accomplishments they have, and things that they do, and the way they interpret information. This is the point and the starting point that you as a person will start building human skills that will help you as you enter into a work-based environment. Things like teamwork, figuring out career choices, doing what's necessary to prepare for a career. And so with that is going to come some challenges. And when we talk about them, we're talking about these cognitive challenges, or the way that the brain learns. And so as adolescents in that age range from 13 to 19, they have to start to develop things like logic, being able to be logical about things, and also this abstract thought, or being able to think outside the box, along with hypothetical reasoning, being able to think in terms of what ifs. And sometimes this is easy for some and not for others. And so at this point in the life span, adolescents start to develop moral thought, and then they develop it in three different levels. And the research that's been done on this, usually you also will learn about it in psych class and sociology class, is that at a pre-conventional level in adolescence, everybody is faced with moral dilemmas in their lifetime. And in adolescence, moral dilemmas at the pre-conventional level are going to be resolved in a more self-centered way, which means how the adolescent deals with the moral dilemma is going to be reliant upon whether they are going to get a reward or a punishment for them. So it's all about them. When they start to get to the conventional level, then moral dilemmas are going to be resolved in the ways that reflect laws or norms that were set either by their parents or those other influential adults that taught them about respecting social norms, criminal laws, and things like that. And so that is the next level. And then the post-conventional level is going to be facing moral dilemmas and being able to look or think at these outside the box qualities that at 13 to 19 years old, as you age from 13 to 19, you will be able to start thinking in abstracts such as equality, equity, propriety, and diversity, And when you start thinking in those types of terms, then you start resolving these moral dilemmas based on those types of abstract ideas. And so everybody who steps into adolescence will start at the very low pre-conventional level. And if they start to mature through adolescence, they will eventually get to the post-conventional level of being able to resolve moral dilemmas at an abstract level. There are plenty of people who are always at the pre-conventional level, and they only resolve moral dilemmas based on how it will help them, reward or punishment. And unfortunately, we see quite a lot of those people in our facilities. But the idea is that as you mature and continue to be influenced and grow, that you will move your way through to the post-conventional level. Some of this also is being able to help to establish a self-concept or self-efficacy within yourself that gives you your own personal identity. If you can't, then you're going to get an identity crisis. And there are a lot of adolescents out there that do face an identity crisis in establishing that self-concept, because there's growing up what your parents want you to do. And then as you start to mature and grow, you start to get that idea of what you want to be and what you think you are. And so you start to reach that identity crisis. And part of that is figuring out whether you should retain a close relationship with your family or go to that peer group, all the way to whether you're gender nonconforming or you have a sexual orientation that's different than the expectation. And this can result in behavior that ends up in negative consequences. We also have adolescents that have body image issues, which can end in physical or physiological challenges. And so all of this stuff that's going on in adolescence can be very challenging. So how do we help someone in adolescence navigate that time period, that short 6 years before they hit young adulthood? And what we can do is try and help them navigate or deal successfully with that brain, that's that teenage brain, that is easily influenced by the environment, more prone to impulsive and dangerous behavior, because in that 6 years, the brain is more apt to be involved in emotional responses because they are still reaching maturity. Maturity of the frontal lobe of the brain is only about 80% developed in teenagers. And the frontal lobe does not connect with the rest of the brain until the ages of 25 to 30. So as a result, the adolescent brain ends up telling in that circuitry that their behavior, their impulses will end up rewarding them for their risky behaviors. And it ends up telling them that the rewards will be monumental when they're not really that big. And so, especially in today's society, where social media drives so much of our teenagers looking for their approval and what they can achieve, that the reliance on the brain and the teenager that is involved in impulsivity ends up creating a lot of misunderstandings. And as a result of this, they end up with a lot of decisions that end up being faulty, even though for the most part, adolescents can learn a lot and they're smart. And so that impulsivity versus their capability of being able to learn really good behavior and retain it is what makes being in this particular lifespan so challenging, and helping them through it and navigate it. I think that's why so many people have a tendency to want a chance to help teenagers, and why we have the juvenile system set up the way we do, and why so many people are looking to reform the juvenile justice system from what it was so many years ago when they were trying to make it so much more like the adult system, is because people are now starting to really understand the science behind the way that adolescents learn their behavior, but there's some science involved in it, and we have challenges that we need to kind of work with in order to get them into the next lifespan, and get them out of that impulsive and dangerous behavior, because it's not that they are learning it, they just have that 20% of their frontal lobe that just isn't connected yet, that tends to overrun the rational thought. Now, when we get into the adult life, the challenges are going to be different based on where we are in that adult lifespan. Some of the cognitive challenge are going to be being able to grasp onto creative thinking. The way that we can take the skills and learning that we have attained up until then, either through education or informal learning, possibly group learning, modeling, whatever it was that we did, we now have a core way of being able to use those skills to make a career of what we've chosen. But now what we have to do is be able to take that and be able to creatively think to solve problems, and then use the wisdom that we get from that in order to continue to prosper throughout our adult life. We also are going to go through some personality and social changes. Now, earlier in this particular lecture, we talked about how we can figure out our personality in general, but as we go through our adult life, both in a young adulthood and middle adulthood, so we're talking about a span of 40 to 45 years, what we're going to be doing is figuring out ways to enhance the things that got us into young adulthood, which means making sure that we're staying up on any skills that we need, including interpersonal skills. But we also are going to have to find a way to deal with what's known as either a midlife crisis or a midlife transition, and they're two different things. Now, a midlife crisis is going to be typically, and we've heard the terms before, someone in their 40s that all of a sudden feels like they have not accomplished anything in their life and are going to completely shift their career or lifestyle. So you've got somebody who went into a business and they were doing the 9 to 5. They had the house, the boat, the car, the cottage, and then one day they're in their 40s and they look around them and they decide they're unfulfilled, and they leave the wife, the kids, the house, the boat, and they go into running a hot dog stand in downtown because that's what's going to make them happy. That's a midlife crisis. Okay? Most people in their mid 40s will go through what they call a midlife transition. And what that is that it's not that they feel unfulfilled, but they look at the time in their life and take stock of what's going on, and they formulate new goals. They realize that at the point in their life that they are, they attained what they wanted, and they want to do something else, and they set new goals. That kind of happened to me. I was reaching the end of my 25 years as a sergeant with the Sheriff's Department, and I knew that realistically I couldn't continue in the career trajectory that I was in. Number one, I knew I wasn't going to go any higher, and nor did I want to, but I found that my new interest was in instructing. I had been an instructor for a while. I ran the training unit for a while. And so what I wanted to do is, instead of doing it at the department, is I wanted to take it to academia. And so that was where I started to formulate my new goals. And luckily for me, I was able to transition. That's a transition. That's not one day quitting my job and just being out there doing something that I thought would make me happy. I transitioned from one career to another and was able to do so and do it in a time frame that was workable for me and my family. And so that also is part of working through the lifespan changes. Another thing that's happening within this 40 years, 30 years that we're seeing is what's called the Sandwich Generation Challenge. And because of whether it be elderly people who didn't anticipate living as long as they did, so they didn't save for retirement, or the economic recession of 2008, whatever it is, we're finding that the generation that I am in, I'm a Gen Xer, is finding in their 40s, 50s are kind of sandwiched between two generations, which means they're still raising children, but now they're finding that they're taking in their aging parents, and that presents a challenge itself, in that they have a hard time finding time for themselves, because they've got children and they've got work, and then they've got older parents. And so part of that challenge is to find time to do things that are important to keep yourself motivated and not neglect what's important to you or your marriage or relationship or whatever it is, or personal life, so that you stay healthy also. And so that's some of the things that are the adult life challenges as you go into young adulthood and middle life as we go. When we talk about people who have reached late life, we're talking about people who are anywhere from 65 to 85. I anticipate that this will probably expand as we see people live later in life. But people who are living later in life, they face challenges too. And some of those have to do with their cognitive ability, with the increased prevalence of dementia and Alzheimer's. We see some cognitive decline, and that's normal. But there are some things that can be done to help that even the inevitable cognitive function outside of dementia and Alzheimer's doesn't happen. And that is to have some continued physical activity and what they call cognitive training. Now, cognitive training can be anything from doing things that can make your brain work, such as learning new skills, doing something that makes your brain work. Because a lot of times as you get older in life, especially when you get into retirement, you allow your body to just rest, which is good, but that includes your brain. So your brain doesn't work as hard as it did when it was in middle life, and young adulthood. And as a result of that, your brain then starts to not use itself as much as it was in your younger years, and some of that cognitive function then starts to decrease. So what are some of the things you can do? You can learn a new hobby, woodworking, glass making. You can maybe learn to speak a different language if that's something that interests you. So it doesn't matter as long as you enter into later life, the later lifespan, that late life 65 to 85 span, that you understand that being physically fit and cognitively fit will help with the transition into late life, as well as slowing down that cognitive or that brain function. People are also going to go through personality and social changes. For one thing, people who are in that 20-year range and later in life, they don't focus so much on the past. They stay in the present mostly because they start to see friends pass away, family move away. They start to change what they used to do for what they can do because, bodies break down and things change. And so they start to adapt the best they can because of what life is giving them. And so there's all these challenges that happen to people who are in the later life stages, and that's because of what life is giving them. And so when they're responding to later life changes, we also find that people who are in this late life stage find that they are mostly prepared for the future, and we find that with life satisfaction and job satisfaction through the different life stages, most people are at the most satisfied with their life, their job, their career during middle adulthood, typically in their 50s or 60s. And, at that time, they have already gotten their education, they've had a career, they have gotten married, they've had kids, and so they've achieved everything that they had set their goals for at that time. And so their life satisfaction has reached its peak in middle adulthood. And job satisfaction also seems to peak during middle adulthood also, more toward the late 50s, early 60s, and that shows that as you age, you start to find where you're going to be happiest and what you can do with that creative thinking and thinking outside the box to achieve that and make that happen. Many people throughout their life think about making a change in career. Sometimes before they want to, sometimes as a result of downsizing, sometimes they get to a point where they feel that they have accomplished everything that they could, and therefore it's time to make a change. And so there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you are thinking of changing careers. Number one, you have to have a clear goal and a reason for the change. Just don't decide to do it one day because your boss pissed you off. Okay? Through the years, you're going to have a lot of bosses that piss you off. So make sure that your goal is clear, that you have a reason why you're going to do it other than your boss pissed you off, and that it's a specific goal with an explanation. And so you know why you're doing what you're doing. The next thing is to be thorough, which means make sure that if you're going to change careers, that you get all the information that you can regarding it. Now, a lot of this, again, is geared toward the public sector because it's not uncommon for people within the public sector to change companies or to change jobs within the same company to go from sales to marketing or from, whatever. It's not as easy for us to do. And so if I were to give any suggestions about changing careers, say if you wanted to go from corrections to law enforcement, or from institutional corrections to probation parole, or something along that, then you can follow some of these, because you need to know why you want to change. You need to have valid information, and some of that valid information is going to be, is there room for you? Are you going to be able to retain your seniority? What is their pay rate compared to what you're making now? And things like that. Are you going to have to relocate? This is all valid information that you're going to have to take into consideration. Another thing that they suggest is that if you can, maybe job shadow, find a mentor, somebody who can give you some guidance, who would be willing to tell you whether your idea about changing careers is a good one. What's the job outlook? Does it have a sustainability for you to change your job? You don't want to have security in the job you're in and then find that if you change jobs, you're going to lose that position within 5 years. Make sure that you know what your likes and dislikes are as far as the new career you're going to, and that you build a new career. Again, this is more geared toward the public sector, as far as somebody who might want to leave a company to go into business for themselves, something along that road. Acquiring education and training, and make sure that any skills that you have acquired in the current position you have are transferable to this new career that you're thinking of obtaining, which is always good. Don't try and go for a career into something that you don't know anything about, never tried, and have no skills for. It is a recipe for disaster. Now, one thing that also happens, especially with the private sector, is, like I said, businesses, especially a lot of our global businesses worldwide, will allow you to change careers within the same company. And so a lot of times, and this is pretty self-explanatory with on this slide, is you can stay with the same employer, and allows you to then keep what you've already obtained in the years that you're with them. And so that is one of the things that appeals to people who want to change a job within the same company, but stay with the company because they like what the company has to offer. Now, in reality, this doesn't happen very often, because once you have entered a company as one thing, unless you have the skill set to move to a different career, being able to change careers and stay within the company is usually not that common. But it can happen if you can show that you are able to stay within that skill set. Being able to leave a company to go into business for yourself is an avenue that some people do change. If you are in a career in criminal justice, self-employment following retirement is one avenue that some people have decided to do. Typically, it's more consulting, and it's difficult because you have to make sure that there is enough work out there and you have a marketable idea that makes you, or makes departments and organizations want to hire what you're talking about or what you're selling. So self-employment on average is really hard to do. In the private sector, usually it means that franchisement is only an option. In criminal justice, it makes it that much harder because everybody has a topic that they think by the time they get done with their career that they are an expert on. And so being able to market what you think you would be able to sell to organizations and then make money at it tends to be even that much more difficult. One of the last things we're going to talk about as we talk about learning and perception and going through lifespans is how we cope with change that happens throughout our life and our careers. One of the things that people on average and in reality just don't like is change. And so here are some ideas to take with you, put in the back of that little mental Rolodex that you have, to be ready to cope with change that happens throughout your life and throughout your career. Number one, be proactive. And as a career path, our profession tends not to be proactive, they're reactive. Personally, try to be proactive when it comes to change. Make sure if you start to hear that things might change in your organization or agency, find out what you can do to help with that change. It'll help you be ready for it, but you might be somebody who can help other people who are resistant to change get ready. Also, look for the personal value in something that could be forced upon you, whether it is being sent to a different shift, being sent to a different precinct, whatever it is, find out what would be intrinsic to you in being forced to have that change happen to you. And so that will make it better for you rather than brooding about the fact that you have to change about something. Ask the what ifs, both good and bad. Make sure that you find a way to figure out what's the worst that could happen, what's the best that could happen if this change goes forward. Force yourself to enjoy at least some of what's changing in order to embrace and not think that it's a bad thing. Bottom line, always know that change is inevitable. Because nothing in 25 years that I worked for the Sheriff's Department stayed stagnant. During that time, we saw changes in supervisors, changes in commanders, changes in sheriffs, changes in policy. Everything changes. And so change is inevitable. How you handle that change is going to dictate your learning strategies, how you perceive things, and how you be able to handle the ongoing lifespans that you have. This really doesn't apply to us, but change before you have to get a better deal. There's really no us getting a better deal in our profession, but changing before it's too late is always going to be better. Waiting until it's forced upon you and you're reacting to the bad rather than being able to look at it from the good part of it is always going to be harder than it is. We'll wrap it up with the last couple on the next slide. Stop trying to be in control. We're all probably a little bit control freaks in this particular profession. We can't control everything. You certainly, if you're a line officer and all of your policies come from commanders and police chiefs and city commissioners, whatever, you can't control it. The best you can do is refer to the previous slide and figure out ways to handle it so that it negatively influences you and affects you to the best of your ability. Acquire useful knowledge so that you can get past the change and positively adjust. And this one is probably the best one for us, is get a job that can't be outsourced. Well, that's pretty much us. Stay in the job if you enjoy it. Learn how to adjust to the changes that are inevitably going to come our way. We're going to have technology changes. You're going to see command changes and police chief, sheriff changes, all sorts of changes in your career. And so make sure that knowledge plus skill plus ways that you learn how to cope with change that comes your way will help you make it through your entire career. So that is our chapter on learning strategies, perception, and lifespan changes. And during this particular chapter, we went through our basic learning processes, including the 3 advanced learning processes: classical, operant, and advanced, along with e-learning. We looked at the meaning of learning styles and tried to look at the insight into your own style. We looked about the importance of continuous learning and perception and how that influences our behavior. We looked at the life cycle and the challenges of responding to changes through adolescence, adulthood, and late adulthood. We looked at the impact of the lifespan in general on life and job satisfaction, and looked at dealing with career changes and coping with change. Thank you for your attention on this chapter. A reminder that instead of a case study this week, you have an essay due on your perception. Make sure you read what is in the week 13 folder. And also make sure that you look at the email and announcement regarding your week 14 assignment on that essay. Again, thank you for your attention. We'll talk next week.